She didn't notice when it began. Fear rarely announces itself. It arrives quietly. Not as panic, but as caution. Not as a scream, but as hesitation. It sounds reasonable. It looks like being careful. It disguises itself as protection. And slowly, without warning, fear stopped being a feeling and became her way of living. She stopped making decisions boldly, stopped choosing for herself, stopped dreaming in public. She didn't call it fear. She called it being realistic. She called it staying safe. She called it avoiding disappointment. But deep down, she knew what it really was. Fear had become her language, her instinct, her armor, and her cage. She had plans once. Dreams that made her eyes light up. Ideas that made her heart beat faster. But every time she got close to moving forward, fear whispered the same old questions. What if it goes wrong? What if you're not good enough? What if you try and they see you fail? So she did the safest thing she could do. She stayed still. She stayed quiet. She stayed small. People said she was calm, cautious, mature. They called her wise. But they didn't see the truth, that she wasn't building a life. She was building a fortress. And each brick was laid with anxiety, not faith. She prayed, but even her prayers felt hesitant. God, if it's your will, but only if I'm ready, and if it won't hurt too much, or demand too much, or expose too much. She didn't pray for courage. She prayed for control, for guarantees, for safety, for a version of faith that didn't require risk. But faith doesn't grow in walls. It grows in movement, in steps, in messy decisions, in, I don't know what will happen, but I trust you anyway. She didn't know when her life had become a list of permissions she never gave herself. She just knew that she was tired. Tired of waiting for certainty. Tired of editing herself to be accepted. Tired of standing in a doorway she was always meant to walk through. She wanted to live. But fear didn't want her to. Fear wanted her quiet. Fear wanted her cautious. Fear wanted her safe but suffocated. One day she sat alone with a journal and wrote, I don't know who I am without this fear. And that sentence, that honest, fragile confession, was the first crack in the walls. Because naming fear is the first step to breaking it. And she was finally ready to breathe again. Not perfectly, not confidently, but honestly. This isn't a story about someone who stopped being afraid. It's about someone who learned how to live, even with fear in the room. So if you've been holding your breath, staying safe, hesitating at the edge of every decision, this is for you. Because fear may have shaped the way you move, but it doesn't have to decide where you go. Stay here with me, because this is the moment she stopped letting fear carry her life and started learning how to carry herself. Fear didn't arrive like a storm. It didn't tear down her walls in a single night. It came quietly, the way shadows grow when light fades slowly. Not loud, not violent, just present, just patient. It found her in little moments. When she felt misunderstood, when she was told she was too sensitive, when she tried something new and someone laughed. It didn't need to be dramatic. It just needed her to remember the sting. And once that sting stayed long enough, fear learned her name, and she began to answer when it called. Every time she wanted to try, fear said, "Are you sure?" Every time she wanted to speak, fear whispered, "What if they don't listen?" Every time she wanted to believe, fear warned, "Don't expect too much. You'll only be disappointed." Fear didn't need to shout. It only had to make her hesitate. And with every hesitation, her confidence grew smaller and her doubt grew louder, like a quiet echo in the back of her mind that she eventually mistook for truth. She stopped calling it fear. She called it being careful. She called it being realistic. She called it not getting her hopes up, But what she didn't realize was that fear had begun to write her story. Sentence by sentence, decision by decision, silence by silence. There were people who believed in her, but fear made her believe that their kindness was temporary, that support always had an expiration date. So she never relied on anyone, never asked for help, never allowed herself to dream out loud. And that's how fear stayed. Not by force, not by threat, but by convincing her that it was safer to live small than to risk being seen. But deep beneath the caution, beneath the hesitation, beneath the long list of what-ifs, something brave was still alive. A voice she almost forgot, faint but persistent, that said, "You were made for more than fear." She didn't know how to listen to it yet, but she felt it, like a soft pulse of hope that fear couldn't quite silence. And that was the beginning. Not of being fearless, but of being honest. Of saying, "Fear knows my name, but it doesn't get to write my future." Fear rarely stole things from her directly. It didn't break in or take what was hers. It simply made her stop reaching. It taught her how to live on the edge of possibility, close enough to hope, but never close enough to risk. And that's how fear won. Not by resistance, but by hesitation. She wanted to apply for that opportunity, but fear said, "There are people better than you." She wanted to call that friend back, but fear said, "What if they don't care anymore?" She wanted to try something new, but fear convinced her that failure would define her. She told herself she was waiting for the right time, but deep down, she knew she was really waiting for guarantees, for certainty, for a future she could control before living it. But life doesn't grow where control lives. Life grows where courage begins. She sometimes wondered how different her life might look if she had taken even one step forward when fear told her to stay still. If she had followed the spark instead of the doubt. If she had believed in possibility instead of rehearsing disappointment. She didn't regret the mistakes she made. She regretted the decisions she never made at all. Fear made her think that stillness was safety. But stillness, when fueled by fear, is just another form of surrender, the kind that looks calm, but slowly empties your life of wonder. She didn't fight battles, because she didn't start them. She didn't fail, because she didn't try. And living like that felt less like wisdom and more like slow suffocation. There was a night when she stared at the ceiling and realized something painful. She was living a life that fear had chosen for her. The person she became was not the person she dreamed of being. It was the person she agreed to become when she allowed fear to speak louder than faith. But something shifted that night, not all at once, but enough. Enough for her to see that every "what if it goes wrong" has a silent twin. What if it goes right? She didn't know the answers. She still felt afraid, but maybe the point wasn't to be fearless. Maybe the point was to be willing. Because freedom isn't found in avoiding mistakes. It's found in living boldly enough to make them. And that was the first decision she made for herself. To stop letting fear make them for her. For most of her life, she waited for someone to tell her it was okay to start. Okay to try. Okay to dream. Okay to fail and still be loved. But permission never came. And one day, she realized she was waiting for something that was never coming. Fear had trained her to wait. Wait until she felt confident. Wait until she felt ready. Wait until the risk disappeared. But confidence never comes before courage, and readiness never arrives before the first step. She waited for years to feel safe enough to be brave. Until one morning, she woke up and understood. Bravery and safety rarely walk together. She was tired of living like a guest in her own life, asking the world for approval before taking a single step. That exhaustion, that holy exhaustion, was the beginning of something sacred, the beginning of permission, not from others, from her. She didn't stop being afraid overnight, but she stopped letting fear decide. She sent messages without rehearsing them 5 times first. She said what she actually felt, instead of what sounded acceptable. She applied for things even if she doubted she'd get them. She laughed without worrying who heard. She cried without apologizing. She didn't become fearless. She became honest. Honesty is braver than fearlessness. Honesty says, I'm scared, but here I am anyway. Honesty stands in the doorway of every new beginning and says, this time, I will not wait for someone to tell me I'm allowed to live. That was the moment everything changed. Not because the fear left, but because it lost its authority. She stood in front of a mirror, looked into her own eyes, and quietly whispered, I choose me this time. Not perfect, not confident, just willing. And willingness, she learned, is far stronger than certainty. Permission didn't come from people. Permission came from breath, from the holy knowledge that God didn't create her to live small, but to live present, to live awake, to live as if His love makes room for her future, even when her fear tries to shrink it. That day, she took her first step forward, not because she stopped being afraid, but because fear finally stopped being the reason to stay still. Courage didn't enter her life like a hero. It didn't burst through the door or silence the fear that had lived inside her for years. It arrived the way truth often does, quietly, gently, almost unnoticed. Courage didn't ask her to roar. It asked her to show up, to try even when her voice shook, to get out of bed on days her heart felt heavy, to risk being seen, with no guarantees other than this one, that she didn't have to walk alone. She thought courage would feel powerful, but it felt fragile, like something she had to hold carefully until it learned to hold her back. She felt it when she took a deep breath before speaking her truth. She felt it when she stopped rehearsing her life and started living it. She felt it when she said yes, while fear whispered no. That's when she finally understood something sacred. Courage isn't loud. It doesn't always change circumstances. Sometimes, it just changes her. It makes room for hope. It makes space for healing. It reminds her that survival is not the finish line. It is simply the proof that another chapter is still possible. She used to believe courage was a destination, a moment when everything felt right. But she learned it was a rhythm, a daily choice to keep moving, even when her steps were small. A way of walking with fear without bowing to it. A way of saying, I may not know where this leads, but I will not let fear be the only one who takes me there. And slowly, courage began to make itself at home, in her heart, in her voice, in the way she carried herself when no one was watching. It wasn't perfect, but it was real, and it was liberating. One day, looking out of her window, she felt something she hadn't felt in years. Curiosity about tomorrow. Not anxiety, not dread. Curiosity. The childlike wonder of believing that possibility might still exist. That God might still surprise her. That life had chapters she hadn't seen yet. That's when she knew. Courage wasn't there to push fear away. It was there to remind her that the future is not written by fear. It is written by faith. And for the first time, she was ready to live as if that was true. She used to pray for fear to disappear. She thought healing meant never being afraid again. But now she sees it differently. Fear didn't vanish from her life. It just stopped being in charge. It didn't scream as loudly. It didn't weigh as heavily. It didn't shape her decisions the way it used to. Because now, courage had a voice too. Hope had a place at the table. And Grace was the one who sat at the head of it. She still heard fear sometimes, in small whispers telling her to hesitate, to protect herself, to shrink her dreams just enough to feel safe. But instead of obeying, she listened differently. Not with panic, but with awareness. As if fear was no longer the warning siren. but the signal that something sacred was waiting just beyond her comfort. Fear became the reminder that bravery was possible, that faith had space to grow, that God could be trusted even when the outcome was unknown. She didn't need to be fearless. She just needed to be willing. Courage didn't erase the questions. It walked with them. It didn't promise clarity. It promised presence. And presence, she learned, was stronger than certainty. Now, when fear shows up, she doesn't run. She doesn't freeze. She places a hand on her heart and breathes. "I see you," she says, "but you don't get to decide anymore." Because fear no longer gets to write her story. It only gets to highlight the chapters where growth begins. It doesn't define her path. It points to where faith might lead next. It doesn't cage her. It calls her forward. Fear became the teacher, but courage became the companion. And grace became the air she breathes. So if fear has followed you for a long time, this is your reminder. It doesn't mean you're weak. It means you're human. And humans were made to walk with God through valleys, not avoid them. You don't need to wait for confidence. You don't need to wait for permission. You don't need to wait until you stop feeling afraid. You just need to take one small step and let grace walk with you the rest of the way. Because fear may still visit, but it no longer gets to stay.